Hello! In this mini lecture, we'll go over continental drift and biogeography. Let's dive in. You've watched the short video on continental drift, and you already know that at one point in Earth's history, all of the land was massed in a single supercontinent called Pangaea. Pangaea began to break up about 200 million years ago. As the land masses separated, they moved far apart enough that animals could no longer migrate between them. Eventually, as the continents continued to move away from each other, the species distributions also became fragmented. This explains why similar fossils can be found, for example, on the western coast of Africa and the northeastern coast of South America. This diagram illustrates how continental drift explains some of the patterns that we see in the fossil record. Each of these extinct organisms is represented by a different color. For example, fossils of the Triassic animal named Cynognathus in purple are found on both the eastern coast of South America and the western coast of Africa. Similarly, the ancient fern Glossopteris in blue left fossils on all 5 of these continents: South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia. Now, ferns, even big ones like Glossopteris, cannot swim and are unable to cross large bodies of water. So the only explanation for the presence of Glossopteris fossils on each of these continents is that at some time in the past, they were all connected into a single large landmass. That brings us to this gentleman here. This is Alfred Russel Wallace. He was a British naturalist in the 19th century. He and Charles Darwin worked at about the same time, but in different parts of the world. So they corresponded, but they didn't actually collaborate. And even though they didn't collaborate, each of these people discovered natural selection independently. Now, unfortunately for Wallace, for a long time he did not get any credit for having discovered natural selection along with Darwin, because Darwin made sure that he published his version of the theory first. In science, the first person to describe a phenomenon or come up with a theory that gets universally accepted gets their name attached to it. That's why everybody knows who Charles Darwin is, and relatively few people know who Alfred Russel Wallace was. Wallace studied a lot in the Far East, in the Indo-Pacific, and he was especially interested in islands. He spent a lot of time in the region of Indonesia and the Malay Archipelago. And he was going from island to island looking at things. He was intrigued by a pattern in the distribution of animal species among these islands. The overall pattern was that the western islands had animals that were similar to those in Asia, while the eastern islands had fauna that was more like what he saw in Australia. There seemed to be a very clear demarcation, indicated by this dashed line, between the two animal groups. This line became known as Wallace's line. Wallace didn't know it because nobody at the time knew it, but it turns out that there's a really deep trench that runs right along this line. And this trench is so deep that even at times of low sea level, it was kept full of water, and that prevented animals from crossing it, when these other islands might have been connected to each other by land bridges. Over time, animals on each side of the line took independent evolutionary trajectories and resulted in the pattern that Wallace noticed. Wallace is known as the father of biogeography, as he was the first person to make a scientific study of this pattern that he observed. His contributions to the theory of natural selection are not widely appreciated, but at least he gets credit for having come up with the idea of biogeography. Next time, we'll take a look at what embryos and molecules can tell us about evolution. See you later.